It is my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Philip Bergman from Clark University, who works on a lot of the things that are my favorite things in the world. Lizard biomechanics, lizard functional morphology, trying to understand the phenotype function relationships in animals across broad taxonomic groups. He integrates a lot of techniques, including DNA sequencing, morphology, morphometrics, locomotor behavior, and ecological data in a bunch of different systems, like skinks, looking at limb loss in skinks, and basilisk running. So it's our very great pleasure to have him here and speaking with us, and please take it away.
All right. Thank you, Kathleen. And thanks for the invitation, Kathleen and Alessandro. It's my pleasure to talk here today. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay.
Excellent.
Okay, so is that good, everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I will get started. I guess I'll hide that. Okay. So thanks for coming to my talk. And what I'll be talking about today, we sort of in talking about some options and ideas with Kathleen, we settled on this one, and it's sort of in honor of Darwin's birthday, which was a few days ago, 3 days ago, February 12th. And so I've titled it On the Existence and Persistence of Intermediate Varieties, because I want to talk about one of the things that Darwin sort of was stressed out about, I think, in terms of one of the weaknesses to his theory of evolution through natural selection. And so that's what I'll talk about. Just to introduce myself or my research a little bit more and acknowledge a number of people. So I run the Evolutionary Functional Morphology Lab at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And so I think, again, thanks, Kathleen, for a great introduction, because we study functional morphology and biomechanics and form-function relationship, mainly in lizards, but we also do snakes and some other things as well. But what I try to do with my research is really integrate biomechanics with an evolutionary perspective and an ecological perspective. So I wouldn't really describe myself as a hardcore biomechanist. It's really more that evolutionary biology part of this. And so some of the things that I'll talk about today are my own research, some of it funded by NSF with some collaborators like Cam Seiler and Gunther Wagner and Duncan Irschik, but some of it maybe not part of NSF-funded projects. And some of the research that I'll feature today was work that I did with Gen Morinaga, who was my first PhD student that I graduated. He's pictured right here, and did a lot of field work with me and also on his own. And some of the stuff I'll talk about today is field work in Australia that Gen did, but also links to earlier work that I did. And then sort of also acknowledging a lot of the students, graduate and undergraduate in my lab, that have really been the engine that collects a lot of the biomechanics data and high-speed video data. And so with that, I want to switch gears and talk briefly about Darwin, and then sort of recap some of his work and quickly move into this idea of intermediate forms, right? So Darwin was born in 1809 on February 12th. He passed away in 1882, but somewhere along the way in 1859, he published The Origin. And so that's a great book that if anyone has not read it, I highly recommend it. It is not as heavy as some people claim that it is. It's actually quite fun reading, I would argue. But what I'll start off talking about is a little bit about natural selection. So this may be a little bit basic, but I think it sets a nice framework for many of the things that we really talk about in what we do, right? And here's a picture from one of his journals of Darwin's finches, the Galapagos finches. And this idea of natural selection is really involves a number of key concepts or ingredients for it to operate, right? And so here we have data for Geospiza fortis, which is the one that's circled right here. And it's data looking at the size of the beak or bill depth in parents and offspring, right? So the parent bill depth is on the x-axis, the offspring bill depth is on the y-axis, and the data in the plot are for 2 years, 1976 and 1978, so these are obviously not Darwin's data. Right, but what we see is a couple things here. One is variation. Not all finches are the same, and individuals differ, and this can have important far-reaching consequences. The other thing that we see on this graph is heritability, right? So we're plotting parent bill depth to offspring bill depth, and what we see is positive relationships. So parents with bigger beaks have offspring with bigger beaks, but there's a lot of variation within there. So there's more going on, but we do see this evidence of heritability. If we move on with this, we get to this idea of performance, and that's where a lot of our research comes in, right? It's how does that variation in the phenotype translate into performance variation? So this is data by Anthony Harrell and Jeff Podos and people that have studied finches from that functional perspective, showing that finches with relatively larger beaks actually bite harder. And this is actually important because finches that can bite harder can crack larger seeds with thicker shells. So there's that functional connection that starts to get at that ecological side of things here, right? And what we see in this histogram right here is that finches differ in bill depth based on climatic changes. So drought years, as shown with this brownish curve, during drought years, there's strong selection for finches with larger beaks because during those drought years, the seeds that are available to them tend to be larger seeds. And so individuals that have smaller beaks may have troubles actually cracking those seeds and may starve to death. And that's exactly what Peter and Rosemary Grant showed with their sort of classic research, right? And so here we have these ideas of variation, which we see everywhere, heritability, which we see to varying degrees with different traits, but certainly with bill depth, and then this idea of survival of the fittest or differential reproductive success, right? It's the finches that are able to survive, let's say that drought year, that are able to reproduce and then have offspring that have larger beaks that are able to crack larger seeds. Of course, those larger beaks may not be that useful if all the seeds are small, right? So that's sort of our review of natural selection. But I think there's an important part here, fitness, which we often talk about in evolution. But the point I want to make here, which then leads to the whole rest of the talk. So this is a very basic but important concept here, is that fitness only makes sense within a species, right? So here we have an example of two mammals, humans. There's me with my son, that's a few years old now, and a mouse with its offspring. And if you're simply, let's say, counting the number of offspring or the number of viable offspring or the number of fertile offspring, between species comparisons don't make a lot of sense, because saying that mice are fitter than humans or elephants are less fit than humans or mice or whatever doesn't make a lot of sense, because these are intraspecific comparisons. And then so a lot of people that have then taken macroevolutionary approaches, which is a lot of the focus of my own research, have really broadened this concept, sort of abandoned fitness and replaced it with habitat selection or performance in ecologically relevant tasks when thinking about evolution and natural selection at a macroevolutionary level. So it's performance within a given habitat doing a certain task that a given species or different species need to carry out that becomes important when you're studying this at a macroevolutionary level. Right, and so if we come back to Darwin, I'll simply plant a seed here that we're going to come back to. I guess that pun wasn't intended at first. Later on and throughout this work, and that's this diagram that Darwin drew that has also now become a cliche since his notebooks have become available online, and that's this idea that he drew some of the first, or maybe the first, phylogenies that allow us then to have a framework for understanding how traits evolve across entire clades, right? And so that's critically important. Another part that's important is studying transitions in evolution. And one way of doing that is considering intermediate forms, or as Darwin talked about them, intermediate varieties. But when Darwin was writing on the origin, this was less of a strength and more of something that I think he worried about quite a lot. And that's evident in, let's say, his chapter that's entitled On the Imperfection of the Geological Record, right? And so what Darwin noted was that these intermediate forms are rare in the fossil record. They're absent generally in a single geological formation. They're absent today. And he hypothesized that they were outcompeted by superior forms, right? So these intermediates, they're rare in the fossil record. We don't see them today, et cetera, because they're inferior in some way. And so this is the sort of thing, this is where maybe Darwin left off and where I want to focus, because a lot of these statements actually are only somewhat true or slightly true. And there's a lot of information here on intermediate forms that we have available to us today that allow us to take a slightly different perspective. And that's really where I want to focus the talk today. And so what I'm going to do is talk about a number of sort of classical examples of intermediate forms, as well as caveats with sort of studying them or how we think about them. And then talk a bit about some of my research that really maps really closely onto this idea of intermediate forms, right? So one of the classic examples, I would argue, is the evolution of birds. And birds are interesting because evolution has a lot of these examples that have been for a long time mysteries, because the extant species are so radically different from other species that we have alive today. And birds would be one of those. Turtles would be another, for example. But if we look at the fossil record, what we actually see increasingly, and especially in the last, 3 decades or so, is many transitional forms. And so in this graphic, there's a number, there's diagrams underneath this sort of evolutionary trajectory of the front limbs of a number of dinosaurs, theropod dinosaurs, and birds, showing some of that transition, and that maybe you didn't just arrive at a wing and that's all we have to study. Of course, all of these other wings that are, and front limbs that are diagrammed here are extinct, which certainly makes things difficult, especially when you're thinking about this from a functional biomechanical point of view. Right, and so here's more of a phylogeny, a more formal actual phylogeny of dinosaurs leading up to birds, right? So we've got birds down here, sister to Archaeopteryx, and then various sister taxa that are things like tyrannosaurids and compsognathids, allosaurids, and so on, right? And the point I want to make here is that many of the features that we consider particularly birdy didn't just evolve with birds. There was a progression, and that means we have these intermediate forms in the fossil record, right? So a wishbone or furcula evolved way back a long time ago, around 230 million years ago, maybe. And there are many fossil dinosaurs that didn't fly, including things like allosaurids that had a furcula. This reduction to 3 fingers is developmentally maybe under debate, and there's different perspectives, but this also evolved a long time ago, and certainly before birds did, right? Hollow feathers is another feature that isn't associated simply with birds. Asymmetrical feathers even are something that evolved before modern birds. And then, you know, Archaeopteryx actually had more of a tail and it had teeth, and these features were lost then in modern birds. And so again, a lot of these bird-like features are things that evolved along the way, along that evolutionary tree towards birds. Another example that's definitely classic is the evolution of horses, right? And if we look at it with a graphic like this, we tend to think of it as this progression, or people are tempted to think of this as a progression. There's a transition from browsing on leaves to grazing on grass. And as that happened, we've got an increase in body size from really small animals to what we associate as horse size today, a reduction or loss of limb elements from multiple digits to a single digit, and a transition in teeth, especially the molars, for a more pronounced crown that is more resistant to wear, allowing for grazing on that tougher grass vegetation, right? And here we have some actual photographs of some of these forms. But this then leads me to one of the caveats in teaching these evolutionary transitions. You look at the horse evolutionary tree, you see something that's a lot more complicated, right? If we look at the modern horse up here, then we see a series of ancestors that must have existed, and only some of the fossil forms that we see and that on the previous slide we might view as intermediates are actually ancestral, or maybe ancestral, to the modern horse. Other forms that we have fossils of may be intermediate, but they're not transitions between an ancestral tiny horse and a modern horse. They're on other, they belong to other clades on the phylogeny that have gone extinct, right? And so we need to be cautious in how we treat these intermediate forms and how we view them as not viewing them as direct ancestors, but maybe as proxies for how organisms may have functioned as, let's say, modern horses evolved. And so this leads us, obviously, you know, speaking of cliches, maybe today is full of them, you know, these funny graphics that people put on mugs and t-shirts and so on, and this idea of evolution being a progression and sort of pushing against that, right? That evolution is not simply a progression, and the fossil forms and the intermediate varieties that we do see, we can't treat as ancestral. We need to treat them as organisms unto themselves that are functional. And so with the evolution of humans, we see a very similar situation to what we saw with the evolution of horses, right? We see some fossil forms that may well be our ancestors, but then other fossil forms that almost certainly are not our ancestors, although they still are intermediate between, let's say, extant great apes, such as chimpanzees, and modern humans. right? So again, we cannot line these up in a neat progression because that's not what they actually are in our evolutionary history. Okay, so those are sort of these classical examples. And so I'm going to start transitioning, but I also want to revisit maybe Darwin and the importance of tree thinking, which I think became clear in these last few examples, right? So humans have, for ages, since classical times, had this idea of progression, right? We had the scala naturae through classical and medieval times of putting humans at the top, and this progression from even non-organism objects such as rocks and crystals up to humans and maybe angels and God above that. And so this progression idea has been with us for a long time. But then, you know, at least since Darwin, there's been, at least among some, this realization that that's not really accurate, that it's not about a progression, it's about tree thinking, and that there are multiple branching events and clades. And the different forms that we see, whether they seem intermediate between other forms or not, may actually be on separate clades from the ones that we're interested in studying, right? So I'll put in that plug for Darwin. And so that brings me, that sort of sets up my research. And a lot of my research, I guess for those of you that don't know, is about the evolution of snake-like forms. And so maybe this is one slide I should update. Snake-like forms have evolved many times among vertebrates, and they're also in many invertebrates, but I haven't really looked into that in a lot of detail. But among vertebrates, this is something that has evolved at least 14 times, but I would wager with a proper detailed analysis, probably many dozens of times in fishes. It's evolved a few times in mammals, especially with mustelids and whales. It's evolved in amphibians at least 5 times, but that's also something that probably requires a little bit more study. I would say that number's higher. And then in squamates, or lizards and snakes, it's evolved at least 25 times, but probably more than that as well, right? So I would say my most recent work suggests that we're looking at convergent evolution of snake-like forms at least 75 times, but I think that's an underestimate in itself among vertebrates. So this is a big dominant theme spanning many major clades, at least within vertebrates, that I think is very interesting, right? And it's a large radical transition in body form. And so, you know, the first question that pops to mind is, well, why would snake-like forms evolve? Why would you evolve to be long and narrow and limbless, right? Limbs seem to be useful. And there's 2 dominant hypotheses that have been suggested for why snake-like forms would evolve. And one of these is burrowing, that it's an adaptation for a fossorial lifestyle, that the limbs essentially get in the way, and that a long body that's very flexible allows you to wiggle or even swim into granular substrates like sand. The other hypothesis is that snake-like body forms evolved to as adaptations for complex, or I should really change complex to cluttered habitats, right? Habitats that have a lot of objects in them, a lot of tight cracks and spaces, such as dense underbrush or a coral reef. And that brings me to another important point here, is that both of these hypotheses, and they're not mutually exclusive, apply equally well in aquatic systems and in terrestrial systems, right? So this applies to fishes, it applies to lizards and snakes, and so on. So aquatically, there's plenty of burrowing eels and other snake-like fishes. On land, same thing. Same with the cluttered habitats. You've got dense underbrush, grass, and bushes. Or in aquatic settings, you have coral reefs being sort of the quintessential example. What's also interesting in the evolution of snake-like forms is that in various clades, this body form has evolved in at least a few different flavors, but there's a lot of diversity, right? You may think at first, well, a snake-like thing is a snake-like thing. It looks like a hose. It's long, narrow, with no appendages. But there's a lot of variation. So among squamates, among lizards and snakes, there are forms that have very short tails, and in many cases, these are more robust. So they're thick as far as snake-like forms go, and the tail is very short. These are often burrowers or some sort of fossorial species. We also have forms that have very long tails, right? And these may be relatively thinner in some cases, but that's not a very good generalization. These long-tailed forms, so in this species, this legless lizard, the tail is about twice the length of the body, so about 2/3 of the total length of the animal. And these are forms that tend to be surface dwellers and live in those cluttered habitats. Things are even more complicated because there are some forms that are sort of sand swimmers that have intermediate tails, not super short, not super long. And we'll get to those because they're some of the ones that I study. But coming back to Darwin, overall, intermediate forms are mostly absent, making the evolution of snake-like forms rather difficult. So I've got two examples here. Up top, we've got a flap-footed lizard or a pygopodid. This is an Australian clade where pretty much all the species are limbless or almost limbless, right? Well, the most closely related species to this, the sister clade to pygopodids, is other geckos, actually the Diplodactyly geckos, but geckos. And this is what a typical gecko looks like, very unsnake-like, right? And definitely not intermediate. That's a typical lizard-like, quadrupedal, well-developed limbed morphotype, right? If we look at snakes, the big example of snake-like body forms, then here we have a snake, and the sister group to snakes is a massive clade of lizards, but many of them look like this collared lizard. So again, a short body with large, well-developed limbs, typically with 5 fingers and 5 toes, right? So we lack these intermediate forms to attempt to study how these snake-like body forms have evolved. But there are some exceptions, right? And this is one of Darwin's drawings. And this is an intermediate lizard, I would argue, right? It's got a relatively long body, and it has relatively small limbs, although they still have 5 fingers and 5 toes. So this is somewhere maybe closer to the lizard side of things or quadrupedal side of things. But this is a somewhat transitional, or I shouldn't say transitional, an intermediate variety. And if we look at cross lizards, then there are a lot of intermediate varieties, and there are some large clades that have evolved multiple intermediate varieties, sometimes evolutionarily, maybe transitional, sometimes not, but we're going to get into that, right? So these are distributed across much of the planet, I guess, except North America, right? Although there are intermediate clades here as well. But these 6 clades are probably the most diverse with the largest number of intermediate varieties. And they're all over the planet, right? So Baccia are across South America, and they're little gymnophthalmids related to whiptail lizards in the United States. We've got Chalcides, which is sort of in Mediterranean Europe and the Middle East and Northern Africa. We've got Brachymeles, which I've studied in the Philippines, so they're almost endemic in the Philippines. We've got Hemiergis in Australia, Larista in Australia, which I've also studied, and we'll be talking more about that. And then Skelotes, which is in Southern Africa. And you may be thinking, oh, but he missed this example or that example. There are some other examples. But what I like about these is that they're probably, maybe with the exception of Hemiergis, the most diverse. There's lots of species with multiple intermediate species that are somewhere intermediate between snake-like and quadrupedal classical lizard-like. If we look at these 6 clades, and count simply the number of fingers and toes, then we see a lot of variation. And that's what we see in this graph, right? So we've got number of toes on X, number of fingers on Y, and the circles represent how many species across those 6 clades are in each combination. The A indicates an absence of hind limbs and front limbs, right? So this circle here represents snake-like forms with no limbs, right? But what we see, importantly, is all of these forms in the middle, right? Between this large circle, which is pentadactyl, 5-fingered, 5 toes, and the completely snake-like one. We have a lot of intermediates that we can work with that are extant today, right? And so here's an example of one of those. This is the Australian Larista, and these are different species. These are actually hind limbs for different species, showing that morphocline, going from well-developed pentadactyl limb over here to almost limbless, just a little stub for a limb on the right. What we also see on the left in my original graph is some interclade variation. In particular, what we see is that some of these 6 clades, the ones listed up in the top triangle above the diagonal, if they have different numbers of fingers and toes, then they have more fingers than toes. These 3 clades have the opposite. If there's an asymmetry in the development of the front and hind limbs, then it's the hind limbs that are more developed, have more toes, for instance, right? So there's a good deal of clade-specific variation, but then in all of these clades, we have multiple intermediate forms that we can go out into the field and study, which is easier said than done, but we can do this. Okay, so taking a further look at the body shape of these different animals in these 6 clades, we see similar variation, a ton of variation, right? The previous slide, it looked at only one little element of that continuum between quadrupedal, lizard-like, and snake-like, and that was numbers of fingers and toes. If we look at more detailed morphometrics that include the proportions of the head, the body, the limbs, and the tail, we see this sort of variation. So this is a phylogenetic principal component analysis, but in short, we've got 2 variables. Principal component 1 is on the x-axis, and that's this transition. It actually came out really nicely as an index of short-bodied and 5-fingered and toed on the right to long and limbless on the left, right? Principal component 2 also explains some interesting variation that was interpretable, and that was on these low values we have diminutive species, so small body size, that are really narrow. At high values, we've got larger species, so physically larger, but then also more robust species, so relatively wider bodies. And what I want to point out here is, yes, most of these clades cover that range from snake-like to quadrupedal, but there's also variation vertically. And so not all snake-like species look the same, right? And so here is some of that variation that we see. And we have differences in the tail length versus the body length across these species. We have differences in how large the head is. We have differences in how robust or thick the body is relative to its length. And so a fair amount of variation, which is important here, right? Not all snake-like species are exactly the same. It's easy for us to think about that variation in typical lizard quadrupedal forms, but maybe less intuitive in the snake-like limbless forms. Okay, so if we come back to this, our 6 examples, the 2 that I have focused on with my research are Larista, which I'm going to talk a bit about for the rest of our time, almost, and then Brachymeles, which is right under Larista on this slide, which is the Filipino clade. And I'll talk a little bit about Brachymeles. That's another story that I don't have time to develop today, but I will come back to them near the end. Okay, so Larista. Here's a beautiful Larista species, and I want to emphasize this idea of that we have extant species that are intermediate between snake-like and lizard-like, and Larista shows this beautifully. So in this species, if you look closely, and I know it's rather cryptic, the hind limb is right here. And it looks kind of weird because there are two toes, and you can see them if you squint on your screen, right? There are two toes on that hind limb. The front limb is right here, and actually see a bulge where the pectoral girdle is. And all this species has is a stump for the front limb. No digits, it's just a humerus, essentially, that's protruding. So this would very much be an intermediate form that we can study. This may be a proxy for some ancestral form that has evolved maybe even multiple times in the past during the evolution of snake-like body forms. But again, this is just a proxy because this is an extant species that you can go to Australia and actually collect. Right, so a lot of what I'll be talking about is work that I did in Australia, as well as Gen Morinaga, my PhD student. And I also want to acknowledge Ushio Kawai, this photo on the left, who was my field assistant when I went there. Up top, we've got some more representative species to, again, put some faces to this variation and these intermediate forms, right? So on the left here, we have Larista Pripadita, which is almost limbless, right? They have tiny little stumps for the hind limbs. I guess I've put, maybe this is Apoda, which is why I put absent, but there's other species that have stumps, but they're so small that when I caught my first Larista Pripadita, I thought it was limbless because the hind limbs look like little pieces of sewing thread near the cloaca, right? Here we have a species that has no front limbs and two toes. The one from the previous slide, here's 3 fingers and 3 toes and a relatively long body. And here's sort of a more typical lizard-like species, which is still relatively elongate, but the fingers, front and hind limbs both have 5 digits. So if we look at the evolution of Larista, we can do ancestral state reconstructions. We can also do stochastic character mapping, which is what this phylogeny is, right? So we stochastically mapped how and modeled how digit numbers might evolve. This graph or this phylogeny is for hind limbs, so number of toes. And I've color-coded the branches of the phylogeny by the number of toes, right? So purple is 5, and then you can see the different colors. Red is 1 toe, black is limbless. And what we see, right, most lizards, so ancestrally all of these examples, have 5 fingers and 5 toes and a short body. But within this clade, what we actually see in Larista is that they're still reasonably robustly limbed. 4 fingers, 4 toes, 3 toes, and so on. If you look through this phylogeny, right, this has actually happened twice. So there's 2 major clades of Larista. But from all of the minuses on this phylogeny, overall, the pattern in Larista is a loss of digits. They have predominantly gone from pentadactyl and short-bodied to elongate and few digits or ultimately limbless. There are only a few pluses on this phylogeny, right? There's 1, 2, and 3. And 2 of those 3 are very much near the tips of the phylogeny, so they're relatively recent events that affect few species, and those 2 are actually statistically not significant, right? So it's equivocal evidence of reversal of the gain of digits, right? So in Larista, again, we've got this story of predominant loss of limb, so a transition from short-bodied and pentadactyl to elongate and limbless. Well, being someone that's interested in animal locomotion, we captured these animals, as many species as we could, about a dozen in Australia, and we video recorded them using high speed in the field. We also got them to burrow into a number of different substrates that were natural. So natural sand that we sieved to standardize it, right? And so what we see in this graph here, these are phylogenetically informed analyses. But on the x-axis, you have principal component 1, which on the right is limbed species. So this is the ones that are shorter bodied. They actually have fewer vertebrae and more developed limbs. On the left, you have snake-like species. And what we see is that the snake-like species actually are able to burrow faster than the more lizard-like or quadrupedal species. But we see no such trend for running, or slithering, right? So for surface locomotion, what we see is that all of these animals sort of run about or slither about the same speed. But what we see for burrowing is that the snake-like ones are actually better burrowers. And this is some of the first real functional and phylogenetically informed work that shows evidence for a snake-like body form actually being an adaptation enhancing performance at fossorial locomotion, right? And this is work that we published in the Biological Journal of the Linnean Society. So we did some other work as well, and we were interested in the burrowing force produced by the different species of Larista. And so what we did is we used this device, maybe I'll hide that graph for now, right? This device, which is a force transducer attached or blocking the end of a tunnel with some sand in it, and you get the animal to enter that tunnel, which is in a plastic block, and burrow into that substrate, and you record the force. And so what we found was that to some degree, this was marginally significant. The animals that were more snake-like were exerting less force. And so you may interpret this as actually being able to more effectively get through that substrate. They don't need to produce as much force. But we do see another trend that's interesting to Larista. In Larista, it's the intermediate forms that have, let's say, a stump for the front limbs and 2 toes that are physically larger. And so the symbols on this graph, the size of those symbols is proportional to the body size of the animal. And so what we're seeing is that larger animals produce more force, and the smaller ones, which are often also the snake-like ones, but also the really quadrupedal ones, those are producing less force. So there's a complicated story there that actually, let me see here, leads into some of the ecology that I'm going to talk about next. If we look at Larista in more detail, what's interesting but hasn't been fully studied yet is there's a lot of variation in head shape, right? So we've got species like these top 2 that have very blunt snouts. And we have species like these bottom 2, which are actually the more snake-like ones that have very pointy snouts that are tapering, right? And these are the better burrowers, right? And so there's a connection here that we're actively studying right now with robotics and other approaches. Another result that we found was that the Larista that were more snake-like actually bent their heads less when they were entering the substrate during burrowing, during entry into the substrate. So they tended to go in more straightly into the substrate, and that may be related to that pointier snout. While the animals, the species that were more lizard-like, were actually bending their heads more. And this may be evidence that they're actually using the side of their heads to move substrate laterally as they move into the substrate. All right. The last part of the Larista story that I'm going to share today is that you see some niche partitioning in these species, right? And so this is typical Larista habitat in Western Australia. You've got loamy red sand and acacia bushes. And the Larista live on the interface between the leaf litter under the acacia bushes and the sand underneath the leaf litter. So if you move that leaf litter out of the way and there's a Larista there, it tries to escape by diving into the substrate quickly, right? But what we found was that species, obviously they live in that leaf litter, but the species that are more snake-like actually lived closer to the periphery of the leaf litter mat, which is where sand is probably less packed, and the leaves are also less intertwined, right? We also found that the snake-like species live under smaller leaf litter mats than the more limbed, more quadrupedal species. And so this lets me come back to this notion, an important, I think, take-home message, that we have these intermediate forms, right? But they're not somehow inferior to the extreme snake-like or extreme quadrupedal forms. They're fully functional species, and we need to study them in that form. So what's going on here is that you may find different species with different body shapes under the same acacia bush, but they're partitioning the habitat to minimize competition between them, perhaps, and that's what allows them to persist and coexist. What this brings me to, and we're almost done here, is work on Brachymeles, which are the Philippine skinks. And as you can see from these pictures, we also have a lot of variation. We have species that are completely limbless. We have species that are short-bodied with limbs with 5 fingers and 5 toes. And we have all sorts of intermediates with 2 toes, 3 toes, etc. But the evolutionary story for Brachymeles is very different from Larista. In Brachymeles, the outgroup is ancestral and has 5 fingers and 5 toes and is short-bodied and so on. But at the base of the Brachymeles tree, which is right here, the species are limbless, right? What we see in Brachymeles, then, is we're starting off at the base of their tree with something that's limbless. And then we have the re-evolution, partial re-evolution of limbs, more over here, and the full re-evolution of limbs. So Brachymeles, the species that are pentadactyl, that have 5 fingers and 5 toes, those are re-evolved digits from a digitless or maybe even limbless ancestor, right? So this is almost the opposite story of Larista. And it throws another part of this message out there of this caution in how you interpret these intermediate forms, because sometimes they're not intermediate in the sense of in the evolution of snake-like forms evolving a snake-like form from a quadrupedal form. Here we have reversal, right? And in Brachymeles, we also have situations of coexistence. So these are Gen and Erica, 2 of my students in the Philippines, sampling Brachymeles from in and around a rotten log. And again, within this single log, you can find a small limbless species and a larger pentadactyl species. And we've got some evidence that's preliminary right now that their diets are different, right? That the limbless species is actually secretive and diminutive, and the pentadactyl species is much stronger and more predatory, eating all sorts of things, including other lizards. I'm going to finish up with a couple slides sort of reminding us how important tree thinking is. And one of the quotes that really struck me of Darwin is from a letter to Thomas Henry Huxley, which is that the time will come, I believe, though I shall not live to see it, when we shall have very fairly true genealogical trees of each great kingdom of nature. And of course, that reality is now with us, which is what makes evolutionary biology, or one of the things that makes evolutionary biology so exciting right now. We have things like this, right? And of course, even bigger ones. And I'd like to also end with sort of reiterating, intermediate varieties, we found a lot of them and are finding more and more in the fossil records, but they also exist today, alive and collectible and available for work in biomechanics and form and function and ecology and so on. And so they're a powerful system to study as proxies for how radical body forms may have evolved. And so with that, I'll end, and I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you so much for such a great talk.
Thank
Lots of
you.
food for thought there. Any
Am I
questions?
still sharing? I'm sorry.
No, you turn off your
Okay.
sharing. You're good.
Oh,
I have a question if no one else wants to jump in. I
okay.
have a couple, but we'll start with one. The first thing that came to mind at the end when we were talking about the brachymeles, I'm curious about the morphology of the new phalanges and
Uh-huh.
how, like, are they morphologically very similar to original ancestral pentadactyly digits?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's we've done a lot of work. I could redo this talk and throw out Larista and put in Brachymeles, but Larista's a nice baseline. Yeah, they're different. They're much more robust, right? So Brachymeles, compared to like the ancestral skink or so on, they tend to have fewer phalanges, and the phalanges tend to be more robust. And we think that they're actually re-evolved as adaptations for burrowing, which is why they're sort of, well, more robust and stronger. Because we found in sort of looking at the paleoclimate of where Brachymeles evolved, so sort of in Southeast Asia, right, what today is Malay Peninsula and Borneo and so on, the climate used to be a lot drier. So an interesting part of the Brachymeles story is that when Brachymeles was evolving and was becoming limbless, right, the climate was not tropical rainforest like it is today. It was much more arid. There were conifers growing and so on. And so we think it was much easier to burrow into and much more consistent with the habitat that you find a lot of those other examples that are snake-like that I showed on the map today. So more arid, looser sand, and so on. And then as you start the re-evolution of those digits and limbs, that's where you had climate change resulting in wetter climates and more monsoonal sort of seasonality, wet and dry season, but the dry season is still really humid. I mean, working with Brachymeles in the Philippines, the soil, it's tough. It's full of organic matter. It's full of roots. It's full of other, just debris, detritus. It's tough. We've dug up Brachymeles and these big species that are limbed in like rotten stumps from palm trees, like coconut palms, and they might be, like 6 inches to a foot, 30 up to 30 centimeters under. Right? So they're clearly tough because that's not just something you brush away and there it is. That's something you need to dig into and use strength to get there.
Yeah, no kidding. Kristen has a question. I don't know if Kristen, you want to unmute yourself or if you'd like me to read it. Okay, read. Yeah, so she says, I had a great talk, really enjoyed it. I have a question about, but my microphone is not working. Any idea why forelimbs versus hind limbs would be reduced in different groups? Is there an ecological performance link with reduction in forelimb versus hind limb?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's one. Ooh, that would require, I think, a lot of like developmental work, and I think there's a lot of crazy things going on there. Obviously, I'm sort of punting on the answer here and mumbling incoherently, but so amphibians are a group that are almost exclusively snake-like and kind of weird, and I didn't talk about. But there are species in the genus Bipes that have re-evolved their front limbs, so they have no hind limbs. And the front limbs are short, but super robust with powerful claws for digging, right? So they're sort of like a snake-like mole with front limbs. Completely weird, right? So there's possibly some selective pressures going on there, and that's a really weird extreme example. It may just be these differences between clades, it may just be historical contingency, right? So whatever developmental and historical constraints that clade has and is subject to then affected how they evolved to be snake-like, how that transition happened in evolutionary time. And there is no easy answer. Sometimes these asymmetries are rather subtle, so it's like one extra toe or one fewer toe or finger or something like that. Sometimes they're more massive. Bipes is obviously an extreme. Interestingly, Brachymeles, almost all of the species, they have the same number of fingers and toes. Larista, you've got a much bigger asymmetry, but it's hind limbs, right? If I had to guess from a functional perspective, front limbs can really help you with digging, pushing substrate out of the way, while hind limbs tend to be more propulsive. But I have no experimental evidence really delving into that level of subtlety in it. What I can say is many of these species use their limbs, meaning that they move them back and forth while they're burrowing and sometimes running, even if those limbs look completely useless, and may not be getting much purchase, right? So we probably need to think outside the box, right? Underground, it's possible that even a small limb can act as an anchor.
Mm-hmm.
They could also be sensory structures, right? So just tactile mechanical stimulus to sense that environment, sort of like antennae or something like that. But yeah, why we have that asymmetry is an interesting question, and why it differs between clades. I'm not really sure of anyone that's really addressed that in any big way.
Right. Thanks. Seth, do you have a question?
Yeah, great talk, by the way. I love the
Thanks.
visuals, and it was amazing. I did have a question about what we call intermediate and whether it's correct to say that it's relative to present. So, I mean, what I mean by that is, let's say in a million years, what we think is a modern species, or it's going to be an intermediate. I mean, right now we're using present time to say something is ancestral and something is intermediate and something is present. But is it correct to say that things that we think are, you know, modern now are very well intermediate, and we just, so I was trying to define intermediate in my head and I couldn't because of this reason. I was like, is it just all relative to time?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that's a cool sort of philosophical perspective. I mean, the answer is absolutely, right? Evolution is happening right now, which means that everything is somewhat intermediate, possibly, right? And I mean, we'll be dead by, so we can't find out where that'll go with any given example. But yes, they, you know, we've got intermediate forms available or extant today, and they may be transitional in that, you know, 5 million years from now, that lineage looks very different, right? But how do we decide that they are that way? I think one message is, you know, for, let's say, these intermediate forms that I've been studying, is they could be transitional. We don't know, in that they're evolving in a direction towards like some state likeness or something like that. Maybe not. I don't know. But what's important is I guess I want to push back against the idea is that they may look different in the future because they're inferior. And the important sort of perspective is that even this weird looking animal that has no front limbs and has 2 toes is a functional animal that is able, it's fit, it survives, it persists, it reproduces, it plays an ecological role in its ecosystem, and it may be really successful. So one thing that I didn't mention, but maybe I should have, for Larista, right? those forms that are no front limbs or a stump for the front limb, and then one or two toes, they're the biggest. So physically, they're larger, which means nothing in terms of fitness or whatever necessarily, but they're also the most diverse, right? So if I break down how many species have evolved each combination of fingers and toes, by far the most, it's not the pentadactyl ones, it's not the limbless ones, it's the no front limb and then one or two toes. I don't know why, but it's that, I mean, to me, that's really cool.
Awesome. I have another question.
Okay.
While other people are thinking, it's about the girdles, and when we have a loss of the limbs, what happens to the skeletal and muscular components of the girdles themselves? And then if we get a reversal back, is it not having lost the girdle in the first place, or do we have to reform all of the girdle structures and then the limb as well?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I think, honestly, among lizards at least, most limbless species have some remnants of girdles, including muscles. Sometimes the muscles are simplified, but that's often more distally. One other thing that I can say is that, it's a great question. And for Brachymeles, right? So we were fortunate enough to study a couple limbless species, and one of them, Brachymeles lukebani, we actually, so on our project, we were collaborating with Gunther Wagner, who's, very much, Evo Devo, the grandfather of Evo Devo. And as cool as it was to hang out with him in the field, he brought a microscope and we were, getting embryos and dissecting them and so on. And so the lukebani, they have front limb buds, right? So they develop limb buds that you can see externally. And then they degenerate and get resorbed. And the adult, it's limbless. There's a little depression in an adult specimen where the limb would have been, but there's no like vestigial appendage. There's definitely, I think there is a girdle, but that's it.
Interesting. Oh. Awesome. Well, I guess, we've gone over, of course, because this has just been so much fun. We just can't stop asking questions, but maybe we should head off here, and thank you so much again for such a fantastic talk. It's nice to honor Darwin and certainly these intermediate species are absolutely fascinating. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This was a great opportunity, really fun, and really fun to just talk research. And off I go 20 minutes to anatomy lab.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for making time for us.
No problem. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.